Welcome back to another Sensei series. Today we're looking at 5 ways that you can spice up your guitar solos. We're going to start with some simple concepts and work into some more advanced stuff. As always, if you want to jump around between points, there are links down there in the description box. And there are tabs for every example available through my Patreon. Again, the link also down there in the description. Off we go. 5 ways to spice up your guitar solos. Number 1, avoid resolving on the root. If you need a quick brush up on your musical theory, the root is the note that the chord is built on, the anchor. For example, the root of a B major chord is B. The root of a C minor chord is C. This note is the most stationary. It's the musical equivalent of home base, and as such, it seems like the natural place that we would finish our musical phrases. However, this can sound a little bit bland and predictable. Let's listen to a quick example where I resolve all my phrases to the root. By finishing our musical sentences on other chord tones or extensions, it adds a little bit of interesting flavor to a solo. And if you do eventually resolve to the root, home will feel that much better. Here's an example of this in practice. Number 2, use licks from other genres. It's essential to have a vast musical vocabulary from your primary genre. But if you can interject a lick from another style into your solo, it can really add a nice twist. I personally really love the blues, but I've also studied a fair bit of jazz music. Here's a pretty standard bebop line lifted from a Charlie Parker solo. I've also worked a lot with country music. Here's a cool chicken pickin' line. If I were to use these 2 licks in a blues solo, it could be really interesting. Let's check it out. Of course, this is one example, and this concept works no matter the genre. Number 3, cross string scales. It's a relatively basic idea that's tricky to execute, but can add a nice texture to a solo. What you want to do is replace fretted notes in certain scales with open strings. I picked up this technique from Chet Atkins, and you can hear it a lot in country music, but really it'll work with whatever genre you want to play. So let's say I'm soloing in C major and I'm playing in the 2nd position. These are the notes that are available to me. Well, I know that I have the notes E, A, D, G, B, and E available to me on the open strings. If I were to replace the fretted notes with their open string equivalents, I would have this. While I'm technically playing the same scale, having those open notes ring out creates a nice shimmery kind of sound. Here's a couple cool licks using this technique. This technique works best in the 2nd position and will only work if you're using scales that use those open strings unless you put on a capo. Number 4, add chords. Simple idea, use chords in your solo. Doing this in practice is a little bit trickier, but here are a couple ways that you can start implementing this. First, you can punctuate your musical phrase with a chord. Essentially, what you're doing is playing rhythm and lead guitar at the same time. Let's look at an example. It sounds great, and it forces you to be very aware of the underlying harmony. Another way you can do this is creating chord melodies, a style that was shaped by the great Wes Montgomery. You're going to want to have a pretty firm grasp of the different ways you can play a chord up the guitar neck. For example, in most situations, any of the following chords can be played in place of a basic E dominant 7. I can then go on to create melodies using these chords. Check it out. Number 5, chromaticism. We're getting more advanced here, and knowing musical theory is going to be crucial for this one. Using Western tunings, there are 11 different notes available to us. When soloing, the most obvious note choices come from the basic diatonic scale, which has 7 different notes. So when I'm soloing over a song in the key of C, I would pick notes from the C major scale. Using notes from outside the scale can sound dissonant, or what some might view as wrong. However, you can use this dissonance in a very musical way. One way is to add notes between scale tones, known as passing tones. You don't want to spend too much time focusing on these notes or playing these notes for too long, but when they're used in passing, they can sound really great. For example, I could add in the note between the 5th scale tone and the 6th scale tone. It adds a bit of tension without sounding too jarring, and I can also do this with other notes in my scale. Let's look at a little example of this in practice. Another way that you can use chromaticism is to forget about scales and create patterns that highlight the underlying chord tones. If I have an A minor chord, the notes are A, C, and E. Here's a little pattern that targets a certain note. And here's this pattern in a musical setting. This works because the brain recognizes this pattern while it also highlights the harmony. When I do a lick like this, I like to follow it up with something simple like you saw in the example. You can create tension with chromatics, and it's great to contrast that by playing something predictable. Lastly, number 6, imply alternate chords using your note choices. This is the trickiest concept of the bunch. It's used mostly in jazz music, but sounds great in other genres too. The more complex you get with it, the more knowledge of theory and harmony you need. Here's the idea. Certain chords push or resolve to other chords very nicely. A G7, for example, will resolve very nicely to a C minor chord. Let's imagine a song that stays on C minor. If I imply the notes of a G7 in my solo strategically, it can add some nice tension and release. This is the basic concept, but let me tell you, it's a very deep rabbit hole, which I am not the most qualified person to talk about, but I'll try to give you a little glimpse into the looking glass. So I can also imply a G7 using different weird alternate scales that a G could come from, like a G altered scale, which would sound something like this. Now, you can get really crazy with this and play way out, implying a long string of chords that eventually resolves to a C minor chord, all while the rhythm vamps on a single chord. This sounds really cool when it's done well, and if this concept interests you, I would really recommend diving into some John Coltrane. Alright, and there you have it, 5 things that you can do to keep your guitar solos from sounding dull and boring. I've got 2 very important things to mention here. First of all, there's a lot to work on here, and you shouldn't try to take on everything at once. I would recommend spending a fair bit of time on each one of these things until they start coming out naturally in your playing. Take your time, because rushing through these concepts isn't really going to help you at all. The other thing that I want to mention is that first and foremost, always let the song guide you. What I mean is that you shouldn't be trying to force these ideas into a solo when it's not appropriate. Implying a bunch of altered chords when you're playing in an AC/DC cover band is probably not the best idea. Listen to what the song called for. The best musicians always are the most tasteful ones. If you'd like the tabs for the examples in this video, or you'd like to contribute to my page, please check out my Patreon. I've got a link for you over there. Without the support of people like you, I quite simply would not be able to make these videos. Any little bit of help is truly appreciated. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe. I'm Samurai Guitarist, and I will see you again soon.